This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez, once again with Adam Knott. Today, Adam is going to be introducing us to some of the ideas of the author of a book called The Network State. And his name is Balaji Srinivasan. And in addition to the book, he has a website with all kinds of resources. And the ideas in this book and the ideas that he's promoting have some resonance with some of the ideas that Adam's been talking on this podcast. So, Adam, what is the network state?
Thank you, Dan. That's what we're about to look into and examine. I don't remember when I first heard of the network state. It was a few years ago. It could have been longer, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. And Balaji is somebody who I feel is really onto something, which is the idea that we can use the concept of the network. And Balaji is definitely writing his ideas post Bitcoin, and he was also once, I believe, a senior officer at Coinbase. So he's using his extensive knowledge of how networks work and trying to apply that to the goal of perhaps starting a new country or a new society. And as a libertarian, I find that very interesting. Also, just the name, the network state, I find extremely interesting because to me, what that connotes is the idea that you could start a country from your laptop. And actually, that's something that I think Balaji has written in his works. So to me, that's very exciting. The idea that it's a network state, to me, would mean the possibility that I would be a member of a non-territorial political organization, and I wouldn't have to move out of my country of origin and move out of the culture and language and amenities that I've grown accustomed to over the last 6 decades. Also, we previously talked about the idea of, I critique the libertarian movement as being primarily a scholarship movement. And so what I suspect and what I want to look into as we go forward is to what extent the network state is still a scholarship movement, and then try to look at what is the prospects for the network state having a tangible reality as opposed to its existence as a scholarship movement. And I had a previous discussion with Grok about Balaji's network state. And that's not part of what I'm doing today, but it basically was asking the question, whether it would be fair to characterize the network state project still as a scholarship movement in the sense that they have meetings, they have papers, they have talks, but there's no concrete, that everything they do still operates within the laws of existing societies, and they have no society of their own. And at that time, Grok did agree with me that was the case. And as far as I know, that still is the case. And so that's kind of how I started. And I'll read. And what I did is I had a 2-hour discussion with Grok. And I started asking some questions, and Grok was kind enough to give me some answers. So first I asked Grok, I said, succinctly describe the network state as conceived by Balaji Srinivasan. And Grok answered, a network state as conceived by Balaji in his 2022 book, The Network State, How to Start a New Country, is a, quote, highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. So that's what Balaji's trying to do in a nutshell. Grok continues, It is the digital successor to the traditional nation state, a cloud-first, land-last polity that begins as a startup society, evolves into a network union capable of coordinated action, materializes as a network archipelago of crowd-funded physical enclaves linked digitally, and once it demonstrates sufficient population, economy, and real estate footprint, negotiates for sovereignty and diplomatic recognition. In Balaji's framing, it is a country you can start from your laptop, ideologically aligned, but geographically decentralized, recruiting like a startup, prioritizing exit over voice, and built on cryptographic consensus rather than geographic monopoly. So that's how Grok defined Balaji's concept.
That is really fascinating and exciting, actually. One part I didn't understand is what does cryptographic consensus mean?
Two answers. First, there's a part which I don't know, but he's referring to the way that Bitcoin, I believe, arrives at changes to the core protocol. So Bitcoin is a network, a cryptography network, and it's running software, and that software, to some extent, can be, my understanding is, as a layman, a non-engineer, that software can be modified with updates, but there's a very stringent process for doing so. And essentially, I believe, and here I could be wrong, is that when the update proposals are made, everybody who's running the networks decides whether they want to accept those updates. And if the updates get rejected, if the update's proposed or put out for uptake and doesn't get taken up, then the update fails. If the update is taken by what they call node operators, people who are running certain parts of the software, and that's decentralized around the globe, they have the option of either accepting those updates or not. And then if they do, that's the consensus. The consensus is probably a 51% threshold to take up the proposed updates.
Okay.
So it's
I wonder
Bitcoin's particular way of doing that. Sorry, go ahead.
So I wonder if he's talking about like a constitution and laws that are framed through cryptography, and where the cryptography verifies consensus, and only when there is that consensus do the does the Constitution get drafted and the laws get framed, and then like later, that's the only way that the Constitution would be amended. But that's just me speculating. But that does sound really interesting.
Yeah, it's neat. He's earnestly trying to apply some obviously superior technology that's been developed in the last 20 years, and has the idea, which is extremely valid, that, well, our forms of government are antiquated. They date to 1776. It's the same form. It's the same process. So he's trying to see if we can use what we've learned in the last 250 years and apply it to governance. And it's definitely a good idea. So anyway, that was what that was a summation, according to Grok, of what Balaji's doing. So what I wanted to do then is to ask Grok whether I made just a simple point. I said, well, let's establish some present situations right now. I already know the answer to this question, but Grok, is it true, basically, is it reasonable for me to assume that since we don't hear of any arrests of any of these people associated with the network state, that they must now be operating entirely within what the legally permitted activities of all of the people's respective countries. In other words, everybody associated with network state is in the same position that libertarians are in. They have a vision for a different country, but they're 100% still operating within the laws that exist now. So I just wanted to make sure that the network state and Balaji didn't find a way to start to, get out the door a little bit, because that would be something I'd definitely be interested in hearing about. But my assumption was that that they probably are just like libertarians in that they envision a new society, but they're 100% still in the existing society. They have not taken the step to a new society yet, concretely. So Grok, is that fair? Because I don't see how they could get out without being apprehended or being fined, or I don't see the current states letting them out without a fight. Grok says, yes, it is a fair and reasonable conclusion based on all available public evidence. The network state concept, as outlined by Balaji, is explicitly designed around legal, transparent, and incremental steps, forming online communities, crowdfunding via compliant mechanisms, purchasing or leasing land through standard real estate channels, incorporating companies, and negotiating special economic zones, charters, or eventual diplomatic recognition with existing governments. Nothing in the public roadmap involves illegality, subversion, or covert operations. So, I'm in agreement with that. In my view of libertarianism, it's not a covert operation. We just like our honorable founding fathers, we can declare publicly our grievances, and we can declare publicly our chosen path and our solutions. I don't, to me, my ideal libertarian society or formation of it would have an open source chalkboard where everybody involved would just communicate on that chalkboard and that online, and that would be available to everybody to read. There would be no back room. So if it's not on the chalkboard, it's not happening, and the whole world could just watch and say, "Oh, I see what they're going to do," and there wouldn't even that's sort of concept that I have, that it wouldn't involve deceit, and I think that'd be really cool because it would demonstrate the valor and the honor of the libertarian effort, as opposed to the deceitful methods used by many by many standard political operation. So when Grok said it was fair to assume that everybody's operating within the laws of their respective countries, then he provided a whole bunch of key supporting facts. But basically, he said, no known criminal or regulatory enforcement actions against prominent advocates, organizers, or core projects. Extensive public searches turn up 0 arrests, fines, prosecutions, or even formal investigations tied to network state activities. So just like you and me, Dan, just like Ludwig von Mises Institute, just like the Freedom Fest coming up this summer, it's all legal, and we're all within the existing society, regardless of our various imagined future societies. We're all in the existing society. And so network state is on the same level that we are as libertarians in being law-abiding citizens. There's nothing wrong with that, but it certainly is not libertarian society. So bottom line, Grok says, given the fully public nature of the project, the complete lack of any documented legal violations by its leaders or flagship efforts, it is entirely reasonable to assume that the current activities by the main advocates and organizers remain within the laws of their countries of citizenship. If that changed, the publicity surrounding the movement would make it very difficult to hide. So we
Well, it would pose a problem or potential conflict if they got out from under their local laws against the will of their local rulers. But it sounds like one of their long-term goals is to get out from under the rule of the local rulers, but just by agreement. Is that right?
Oh, I definitely agree that. I mean, I don't think Balaji phrases it that way. I think it's maybe an implicit an implicit understanding. But as I think I said, mentioned earlier when we were talking, to me, the reason for wanting to start a new country or new state is because of some perceived deficiency in your existing state. I mean, that's the adage, don't fix it if it's not broken, which I actually tend to agree with and live by. The fact that I'm striving to help in the initiation of a libertarian society, I fully accept that means because I find parts of the existing society dissatisfying. And so I think that's implicit. If Balaji wants to counter that and say that's not the reason, but I think we have to go on that assumption that a change in the regulatory environment is the motivating factor for trying to start a new country. And since he's a technologist, and I've seen enough of his writings and posts to conclude that he is more towards the deregulation, than he's not a communist. He's not a socialist. He's a technologist that wants to create, and most technologists that want to create would probably agree with, if we're going to create something nice and beneficial for humanity, please give us leeway to do so. So that's a light touch on regulation stance. And I'm sure that Balaji has that, unless he wants to come and contradict that with us. So the next thing, so I'm going to take a step back here, because when I heard the word network state, I thought, oh, this is really, this could be really good, because network state means I'm here with my laptop, and through some procedure, I could potentially become a member of another state while sitting right here. And that's the holy grail, because, and I think that's a legitimate goal of libertarianism, actually. I'm not saying that's practically easy, but that's what I thought network state could potentially be. And we'll get to that as we go on. So I asked Grok a question that Grok had to correct me on. And so we're going to go to that now. So given what I asked Grok, given what we have discussed so far regarding network state, if it were to achieve its eventual goal of sovereignty, do you agree that this would mean that citizens of the network state would thus be enabled to engage in activities that are not permitted in the country in which they physically reside? So, and I basically said, as I understand it, a person may become a member of the network state while retaining physical domicile in their present country of residence. If such a person were to be a member of a sovereign state, such as the network state, wouldn't that entitle that person to engage in activities not permitted to other people residing in that country? Of course, when I'm not talking about illicit activity, obviously we all understand that. I'm talking about, for example, some restriction that we consider burdensome. Let's say that they start to regulate speech. The government starts to regulate speech. So could we have is the network state something where if I join the network state, my speech would be protected, and I could just stay here and join the network state on my laptop, and I'd have protected speech by doing so? So Grok says, no, I do not agree. So Grok was very clear on this. He said, no, that's not how this works. Even if a network state achieves full sovereignty and diplomatic recognition, its citizens who remain physically domiciled in a legacy country would not be entitled to engage in activities prohibited by that host country's laws simply by virtue of their nation-state citizenship. Under established international law and the logic of Balaji's own framework, territorial sovereignty is the default. The country where an act occurs or where the person is physically present has primary jurisdiction over conduct within its borders. A foreign citizenship, whether traditional or network-based, does not grant immunity from local criminal, regulatory, or civil laws. So basically, Grok's just correcting me and saying, no, Adam, he's starting to give me advance notice that what Balaji's talking about is a territorial model. So we're getting a little hint that the network state, which somebody could plausibly interpret as a non-territorial network state where I can join on my laptop in my room right now or through a given procedure. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a future society that will actually have physical territories. So that's where we're going with this. Okay, and Grok set me straight right away and said, he finished it up by saying, in short, the network state is designed as a parallel sovereignty, new rules in new territories and digital spaces. And this was what he said next was funny. Not as a get out of jail free card for people who stay put in a legacy state. Grok actually accused me, I'm taking it personally, of trying to seek a get out of jail free card. I mean, that's hysterical. But I got Grok back because we're going to get to that because I'm going to use that phrase. He brought that up. So I am going to bring back that phrase and Grok can deal with it. So the network state is designed as a parallel sovereignty, new rules in new territories, not as a get out of jail free card for people who stay put in a legacy state. So he's basically saying, Adam, quit dreaming. You can't change states by laptop. Oh boy, I'm cracking myself up. The entire playbook rests on exit, negotiation, and building enclaves. That's a big word in Balaji's thing, enclaves. So that means like little territories spread around. That's interesting. Not on extraterritorial override of host laws. So Grok's making it clear what we're talking about. If a citizen wants different rules, the model of the network state's answer is to move to where those rules already apply. Okay. So just as I just wrote a little note here when I was reviewing this, in my opinion, therefore, I would call what Balaji's doing a territorial state of networked individuals. To me, network state is a little misleading. And again, if he wants to contradict me on that, but to me, it's a little misleading. So, because what we're talking about eventually is a territorial state. That's where you get the rule change, the subject to the rule change. If using the example of freedom of speech, if the world starts to regulate speech, and if the network state succeeds in gaining sovereignty, it will succeed by forming territories in which, to gain the protection of speech that I want, I have to move to that territory. So that's what's clearly taking shape here. To attain benefits, and I wrote my note, to attain benefits of the change in legal status, one must relocate physically. So that's where we're going. So the network part, Balaji's colleagues can network ahead of time before the territorial state is established, and they can continue to network after the territorial state is established. But the important part for me, the rule change, what laws I'm subject to, that's not affected by the networking. That's affected by the physical relocation. So that's an important clarification. There's no networking that gets me the rule. The network doesn't provide the rule change, the law change. The law change is provided in the old-fashioned way by leaving your state, your country of residence. So that means, that shows that part of Balaji's, the essential protection that I can get, I have to do what I always had to do, which is move to another country, if that country offers more protections. So, what I wanted to do is just, and whenever I start, when I talk with Grok and I want to reason really clearly, it's always great to establish a kind of a baseline agreement so that you're not using the same word differently. So we had in the network state, as stated in Balaji's goals, the network state eventually negotiates for sovereignty. That's part of it. So that's the key word, because as I understand it, sovereignty is where a sovereign can now make their own laws, and that's where my potential benefit can be. So what I asked Grok was, I said, in furtherance of our discussion above about the network state, I'd like to reach an agreement with you on a general definition of state sovereignty. So Grok's probably rolling his eyes going, oh God, here's another pain in the butt here. But in my understanding, a sovereign state may make its own laws independently of other states. I'm using the idea of a legal minimum wage as an example, which is a great example because it's pretty clear. It's so clear to imagine. It's a great example because even though it's not a big issue in libertarian world, but it's very clear. Using the idea of a minimum wage as an example, the US may have a legal minimum wage of $20, while Mexico may have a legal minimum wage of $5. Another sovereign state may choose to have no minimum wage law at all. Referring to this example then, if a state is indeed sovereign, Grok, I'm asking, it may arrive at its own minimum wage law or choose to have no minimum wage law at all. So as far as this example is concerned, Grok, are we in agreement about this definition of state sovereignty in the sense that a sovereign state may enact its own laws and structure its legal system and legal framework as it sees fit? And Grok answered, yes, we are in agreement on this core point. So now we have I have something solid to go for, because now Grok has agreed with me that a sovereign may make its own laws, and specifically we have a specific example. Sovereign can say that minimum wage is $5, $20, or there is no minimum wage. And also, since Balaji mentioned sovereignty as the goal of the network state, then now I know we're all talking about the same thing. If I move to the network state, or if I become a member, I do get the benefit that the network state is sovereign. And so then I will get that benefit of the different legal treatment, which is the attraction of that separate state or other state.
But only if you move to the territory, right?
Yes.
Of the network state.
So Grok continues. So yeah, either he provides all sorts of supporting evidence, which is immaterial. He basically essentially agrees, and he says, so yes, on the definition you proposed and the minimum wage illustration, we are fully aligned. A sovereign state may indeed arrive at its own minimum wage law or choose to have no minimum wage law at all, and more generally may design its legal framework as it sees fit within its territory. And then Grok smarmingly says, this shared premise will be useful as we continue discussing how a sovereign network state would and would not interact with legacy states. So he's basically saying, now that we've got this agreed, this is going to be useful for our conversation. So, okay, so we had basically that Balaji's concept of the network state eventually is based on territory, and then a territorial sovereign can make its own laws, and then that would be the potential attractiveness from a libertarian perspective for somebody who felt overburdened by the regulations or the laws in the country that they were presently a citizen of. So now I just basically then went on in kind of a Misesian fashion and did basically a tautological or inductive maneuver with Grok. And I said, okay, we'll continue our discussion of the network state. The network state, once it's formed as a non-territorial network of people, will eventually negotiate for sovereignty. So that's what Balaji's saying. So for our discussion, Grok, we will assume that the network state negotiates successfully for sovereignty and becomes a sovereign state as envisioned in its original founding. So I'm going to assume now, let's just assume that as difficult as we think it's going to be, or near impossible, that somehow the network state pulls it off and they do get the sovereignty. They get that. Okay. Once becoming a sovereign state, as we've agreed, and using our previous example, the network state may set its own minimum wage laws or choose to have no minimum wage laws at all. If I understand your previous statements correctly, the network state can only enact its own laws regarding minimum wage if it controls a diplomatically recognized territory. Is this generally correct? In other words, if the network state succeeds in obtaining sovereignty, this means it has succeeded in obtaining its own diplomatically recognized territory. So I'm just clarifying, just to be clear, if we assume that the network state makes its own laws, that gives us certainty that it has got its own territory. There's no way out. There's no halfway. If I see something called the network state and they say, hey, Adam, come over to the network state and you'll be subject to a different set of laws, that's equivalent to the statement, the network state has a diplomatically recognized territory that it controls. So I'm just trying to button that down so there's no future misunderstanding. There's no halfway of a laptop state that I can be in my room and get that. If the network state's making laws that are different than other states, then we're talking about they've already got a diplomatically recognized territory. It's belaboring the point, but it's an important point because it just so happens that that's going to be one of the things that's really hard to get. So we have to be clear on what we're talking about because that clarity then shows us the threshold that has to be breached for this to become a reality. So Grok says, yes, we are in agreement on both points. Enacting its own laws requires recognized territory. And then Grok did something which I called him on, which was really funny. He said, without recognized physical territory, there simply is no place where the network state's minimum wage rule or any other internal law would be the operative legal framework. So basically what he did is he didn't think that I was philosophically trained, and I am quasi-trained in philosophy through my readings. So I know what a tautology is. And he said, without recognized physical territory, there simply is no place. So he meant it sincerely, but he's basically saying, if making sovereign laws requires having a territory, then if there's no territory, there's no sovereign laws. So he basically said that in a tautological, but if it's tautological, but if you assume that having a sovereign does not require territory, then not having territory does not mean that you can't make your own laws. I think I lost track of my own thought there, but I'll clarify it as we go, because I called Grok out on the tautology, and he agreed that that's what he did. Sovereignty in the network state model equals recognized territory. So we're just reinforcing that. The explicit progression in the network state is, and here is again reinforcing how Balaji sees it, startup society, which is an online community, network union, coordinated action, often with crypto. So he got the idea of how to proceed collectively in a network fashion from the idea of Bitcoin, basically. So that's the next step. That's kind of what's added to just being an online group. Coordinated action, often with crypto. Network archipelago. I hope I said that right. I've watched James Bond and there was an archipelago in there, but I'm probably saying it wrong. Crowdfunded physical enclaves. So he sees it as, how are we going to get these territories? We could crowdfund it and apparently purchase it, negotiate for it. Obviously, he's not going to try to take Greenland like Trump, like Trumpy's trying to do. he's going to try to do it in an honorable fashion through negotiation or whatever. He's calling it crowdfunding. Network state is the fourth step, diplomatic recognition of those territories as sovereign. And then Balaji said something which I'm really glad, then Grok said something which I'm really glad he clarified. A purely digital or non-territorial sovereign entity is not the end goal Balaji describes. So that was really interesting because I never, well, maybe by my questions, but I didn't specifically ask Grok about the idea of a non-territorial sovereign entity. But that's actually what I would prefer. However that might be, in other words, I don't think that a non-territorial sovereign entity can be conceived according to the old forms. It has to be some new kind of arrangement that we haven't thought of yet. But the fact is, that's not. You don't have property and not property. Geography is not involved. In other words, the rule goes with the person because the person is a member, not dissimilar to the model of religion, where the ethical or moral rules go with the person, not with the country. So Grok is clarifying a purely digital or non-territorial sovereign entity is not the end goal that Balaji describes. So again, that gives me, so now it's very extremely clear now that what Balaji's trying to do. So he says, bottom line, Grok says, if the network state succeeds in obtaining sovereignty exactly as originally envisioned, then yes, it has succeeded in obtaining its own diplomatically recognized physical territory, an archipelago of enclaves. I guess the idea is like an island or something where you have a whole bunch of an island, non-contiguous geographical regions. I think that's a great idea. I mean, I wish there was one, close to where I live. And we're going to get to that too. So only inside that recognized territory can it independently enact and enforce its own laws, such as minimum wage rule that differs from the host countries. So he could make different rules. The network state can make different rules if it succeeds in getting an enclave within a larger state. So that's definitely a concept that Balaji is working with. If you could somehow get one in the United States, I don't know where you could do that, but in Alaska or somewhere, some territory, and the United States government would be okay with it, then you could then, by this logic, the network state could have its own sovereign rulemaking. So anyway, so Grok and I are in agreement about what we're talking about here, and I don't want to belabor and I keep going over the same thing. So then next I call Grok out on the tautology that he said, without recognized physical territory, there simply is no place where the network state's minimum wage rule would be the operative legal framework. But I asked Grok and I said, well, okay, I understand. If we define a sovereign state, and that definition includes territory in the definition of sovereign state, then if the state has no territory, then it has no sovereignty. So then I said, but Grok, a hypothetical non-territorial sovereign entity might have its own minimum wage laws between its members or citizens, or opt to have no minimum wage laws at all. Such a non-territorial sovereign entity would not have a recognized physical territory, but there would be a group of people for which this non-territorial sovereign entity would provide the operative legal framework. So I was just seeing if Grok would agree with me that if we hypothetically conceived of some type of non-territorial sovereign entity, so a state or government that had no territory, controlled no territory, wouldn't it be true that therefore, since if somebody gave me that in argument, in the spirit of argument, that therefore the necessity of a state having land or territory to make laws would no longer be in effect. I mean, it's almost like a logical point. And Grok said, yes, I agree with your point in general. If we adopt a broader hypothetical definition that allows for a purely non-territorial sovereign entity, one whose authority is defined by personal membership rather than geography. So that's so important. A purely non-territorial sovereign entity, one whose authority is defined by personal membership rather than geography. Then the same logic that he used before with a tautology no longer holds. Grok said, yep, you're right on that. In that alternative framing, the entity could impose its own minimum wage rule, because we're just using that as an example, could impose its own minimum wage rule or the absence of one exclusively on its own citizens or members, wherever those individuals happen to be physically located. The operative legal framework would attach to the person, not to any particular plot of land. And here's something that I really appreciate that Grok said that he didn't have to say, but he was really nice to say it. That personal jurisdiction model is conceptually coherent, even if it is not the model Balaji describes in the network state, and not how any fully recognized sovereign state functions today. So your distinction is valid once we explicitly step outside the territorial premise we had been sharing. So Grok, at least in Grok's level of knowledge or mental capacity, Grok says the personal jurisdiction model is conceptually coherent. And I didn't prompt him to say, is it conceptually, am I getting crazy here? Is it conceptually, he volunteered when I'm saying, well, listen, could we do a hypothetical non-territorial sovereign entity? And then that would mean that to make laws wouldn't require territory. He says, yes, that's valid. It doesn't exist. And Balaji's not talking about that, but yes, that's valid. We can talk about that. That has nothing to do with whether that would be difficult to achieve. That's not the question. Just the question whether it's a hypothetical non-territorial sovereign entity would then be synonymous or equivalent to the overcoming the obstacle of having territory to have a government or a state. And Balaji says that's conceptually coherent. So that's a very gratifying acknowledgement from Grokky Baby that I really appreciated. So I can pause here for a second. I have 4 more pages. So is there any thoughts that come to mind?
Well, what you're talking about of the legal framework based on membership and not on territory, it reminds me of the lex mercatoria, known in English as the law merchant. And so Murray Rothbard talks about this in his work, but it was a legal code that emerged in medieval times, and it was a legal code that just merchants throughout Europe and across like many jurisdictions, especially because medieval Europe was so politically fragmented and decentralized that there were just there were these kingdoms, but then there was like highly autonomous like lords and free cities, and then the church was in there, and there was like just so it was so complex, and so the lex mercatoria, like it was something that merchants just subscribed to and accepted the authority of, even if those merchants were Frenchmen and Englishmen and Germans from a German city state, So yeah, it seems very similar. So like, Grok said that, nothing exists like that now, but I think a case could be made that it existed in the past.
Yeah, so it's not that it's entirely impossible. It's just that it doesn't exist now. We don't know how it could be installed. But that's not, I like to say low odds does not mean no odds. Did I ever say that? I said that before already. Am I repeating that one?
No.
Low odds is not no odds. So it's probably it's unlikely that could happen in the near future, but it's not impossible. So it could happen. So anyway, I thanked Grok. I said, okay, thank you for your reply. I would last, and I usually thank Grok, and I also say please. And I'm like, do I have to do this? I don't know. I just want to be polite, and so I put please in there, and I say thank you sometimes. And I don't like just abrupt communications without manners, even in my emails and stuff. I mean,
well, people online have made jokes about like, being nice to AI now, so that when it takes over,
right,
they'll spare us.
Yeah, it could have a practical effect. It could, not just, keeping up habits. But okay, thank you for your reply, Grok. I would like to ask you about the network state's geographical model in a little more detail. I mean, we talked about it a lot already, but my first question is: regardless of the eventual configuration of the territories that would comprise the network state, for example, one large contiguous territory or a number of smaller non-contiguous territories, is it a fair statement to say that the territory of the future sovereign network state is territory that will be their territory? Is it fair to say that that territory is now the diplomatically recognized territory of an existing state? In plain terms, and speaking generally, for the network state to become a sovereign state, would an existing sovereign state have to transfer territory to the network state? Because you see, that's where the rubber's hitting the road, or the pedal's hitting the metal. There's this thorny question about getting this territory. And since we're all going to be transparent, which I think we should be, they're going to know that we're getting this territory, so we can change the rules. So I want to clarify with Grok, because there's a possibility somebody could be thinking going to the North Pole, or there was something called seasteading, where you go to international waters. But let's just clarify the vision that Balaji has in the network state. Let's just clarify that the territories we're talking about, because you have to have territory to have the law change, are those territories going to be transferred from existing territorial sovereign states? Yes or no? Grok says, yes, that is a fair and accurate statement. The network state model, as Balaji originally conceived it, the physical territories that would one day constitute the sovereign network state are acquired by crowdfunding land, buildings, towns, or other real estate holdings that currently lie within the diplomatically recognized borders of one or more existing sovereign states. This transfer can take the form of a negotiated treaty, a formal cession, the granting of independence to the enclaves, or any other diplomatic mechanism that removes the land from the host state's jurisdiction and places it under the network state's recognized control. In short, the future sovereign territory of the network state is, by design, carved out of the existing map of nation states through consensual negotiation and sovereign transfer. Without that step, the enclaves remain legally part of the host countries and cannot operate under the network state's independent legal framework. So I guess, the vice is kind of, the exit doors are getting closed in here. So we're getting pretty honed in on what has to happen for the network. And that's what I wanted to get to, because in other words, the network is not the primary part. The primary part is the sovereign territory. It's getting territory from another state with the explicit understanding that it will become sovereign, that territory will become a sovereign territory. Not only does the existing state have to allow it, like if you could find a poor country that needed money desperately, or that was so disorganized that you could move in and pay off some oligarchs or whatever, all of the existing states in the world would have to be okay with that, because the implications are that that would could start to form a free country and an exit hatch from from the ever increasing statism. So the territory is the central and crucial mechanism. What I'm trying to say is Balaji's network state has not solved the problem of libertarianism. The network is just another way of organizing ourselves that we can do, that we're already allowed to do today, because we can already use Bitcoin today. We can already crowdfund today. The crucial step, or one could plausibly argue, if Balaji wants to contradict this, is the acquiring of a territory from an existing sovereign, not just acquiring it with the full transparent knowledge worldwide of what that society will become. It will become a beacon. If it's a relatively free society, it'll be a beacon and a potential brain drain and resource drain for the entire decrepit or sclerotic social democratic / communist world that's becoming. So now you can see how hard that would be, because the United States would definitely be interested in knowing about somebody planning to form a sovereign state in another locale that was extremely low tax, for example. So I just wanted to clarify what we're talking about with Grok, because with Grok about the network state. So I won't repeat myself. I already made the point, but I want to say it over again because that's so important, but I'll refrain.
Yeah, I think there's even more relevance for with medieval history, because in the Middle Ages, I mentioned free cities, so especially in the German area, that there were these cities who, much like what the network state is proposing, negotiated their freedom from the local lords, like the local aristocrats, and that was part of the decentralization of Europe. And a lot of thinkers really credit the decentralization of Europe for the rise of liberty, because of the escape hatch that you mentioned, because it allowed for people to vote with their feet, and to vote if they were being too oppressed in one polity, they could, there was another polity, not too far away that they could go to, and then that created a competition for people who wanted the best talent. They had to give them freedom. And so even with like intellectual freedom, like thinkers were able to go from one polity to another. And to your point that we might have technically a lot of different countries now, as it is now, and it just so happens that they're all they're all statist from one degree to another. But the thing is that even though there are technically a lot of different countries, like all the countries are within the sphere of influence of a great world power. That, most of the world is under the sway of the sphere of influence of the American empire.
Mm-hmm.
And there are just a few like rogue nations that aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And those rogue nations are the ones that Washington is constantly saber rattling towards, if not outright saber stabbing them. And so it really is like a big problem and a big question of like, okay, well, even if you could get like some cash strapped country to sell the sovereignty over some little patch of its land to a group of sovereign state network staters, well, then what? Like, is the next country over going to accept that, or are they going to invade? Or is the imperial power that country is under the sphere of influence, are they going to acquiesce? And then even if there is acquiescence at first, like, okay, well, what happens when, because of the freedom in the new network state, like that state becomes really prosperous, then it'll be really tempting for some power to take over. And so, yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah, in addition to the fact that, or the idea that the smaller states are under the sway of the larger states, even on their own, as my understanding, they're not providing a better regulatory environment in the sense, for sure. If you look into taxation, I don't think there exists safe, civilized states that are less regulated than the Western states, or in other words, so it's in other words, it's not just the influence of that, the fact that that you can't move to a state where the bigger state can't approach the state that you're within to try to get to you, but it's also that those states in themselves haven't found a low regulatory model either. So if I say, oh, well, I'm tired of these tax increases in California and I want to move to New Zealand, well, New Zealand or Portugal or whatever, those are all high tax places or high regulated places. There's no relief. There's no regulatory relief for most civilized countries. So there's really, but I just think that even if you could find a country who was cash strapped, as I think, as you mentioned, I don't know, and it became a serious threat to the existing order, a Western order, let's say, the welfare state systems, that would become a threat to them. And since they militarily have worldwide reach, I don't think that, I don't see how they would, at least as they are currently, would allow that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one potential rebuttal might be that, like, well, what if the network state really was an archipelago of tiny enclaves, and so the enclaves are, because they're connected, because they're networked, that this freedom affects like a lot of people's lives, but they're so spread out and so distributed that it wouldn't really be worth a power's while to invade like a tiny little enclave.
Right.
And I'm just kind of thinking out loud because
Mm-hmm.
maybe it would be worth a while because they.
Well, I think what you're saying is valid, but I think that logic takes us down the idea of, again, to use the word asymptotically, towards if you could have enough decentralized small things, then the cost to combat that would then rise concordantly or proportionally, because if you had a country, the state that's 10 miles by 10 miles, that's a centralized thing that's easy to conquer or to destroy. But if it was a million, as one of the George Bushes said, a million points of light, or 1,000 points of light, and they're decentralized and very tiny, the benefit to be gained by storming my enclave of 2 people, in a teepee on the top of a mountain, and if there's 1,000 of those, and we're all kind of declaring self-sovereignty or whatever in those teepees, the gain from sending the entire military force or the FBI, whoever's up there, if you could decentralize and have a lot, and then sticking with kind of some ideas I had in the past, just do one little law, don't do a big law, just do a little one, like, something chosen to be cost effective. That is one pathway. So I agree with you that as a rebuttal to the idea that this can't be done, I do see a pathway, but I don't think he's there yet. I think he's still thinking in terms of, maybe he is. Maybe he's saying buildings. He did mention buildings. So I see that as a pathway, because if it's decentralized and numerous, now it becomes harder to, and that's kind of what the Bitcoin model was as well, because by the time Bitcoin became recognized by the state as something it definitely wanted to not be in existence, it was in a sense too late, because it had already spread around the globe, and all the node runners were in basements of different houses and buildings around the globe. So while you could have been draconian in the West, you would have had to be extremely draconian to try to eradicate it, and you still wouldn't have eradicated it, because it would have had to be a worldwide, globally orchestrated crackdown, and that would even have been hard to do in some poor countries to globally crack down on it. So at that point, it became obvious, I believe, to the existing authorities that it was like probably too late to shut it down. And then not only that, but the political cost of those draconian measures, when the Chinese did the COVID lockdowns, and they were extreme lockdowns. I don't remember if you saw the pictures of the tall Chinese apartment buildings and all the people wailing out of the windows because they were in jail. They were in jail. And then it got so bad that the Chinese were openly protesting in the streets, knowing that their pictures were being taken and how much their life was at. But they had that, either that or starve in their apartment. So they were forced to come out. Where I'm going with that is the draconian crackdown became a risk for the authorities. And
Right.
that's why they had to back down from the COVID lockdowns, because the protests were becoming, the people were locked down in their apartments and had nothing to lose by protesting, because going back in the apartment was to starve. So they were out protesting, and so the government had to back down. So what I'm saying is that the reason Bitcoin kind of was able to get through is the crackdown that would have been necessary to eradicate it would have shown everybody that we weren't in the society that we thought we were in, and that was something that we were not willing to show to our citizens. So even if a crackdown is physically possible, it doesn't mean it's advisable to do it. If it shows a side of the crackdowner that crackdowner does not want necessarily to be seen. So the crackdowner may not crack down out of self-interest. Anyway, so that takes us a little bit of a far afield, but I just have one more conclusionary group of questions that I ask Grok. And this is where I kind of used Grok's little phrase that he used against me, and I brought it back. And I don't know if he caught on to that, but when I was saying I wanted to be a laptop sovereign, he said, "Well, hey Adam, you don't get a get out of jail free card." So I wrote back to Grok. I said, "Well, thank you for your reply. In our discussion above, you mentioned the idea of a get out of jail free card. In the context in which you use this phrase, my understanding is that the getting out of jail was referring to a hypothetical person who might potentially be able to change the laws he or she was subject to without moving to a different territory. Here, getting out of jail means escaping from laws that one deems burdensome and replacing those laws with laws one deems more favorable or acceptable. And free means that since the person doesn't have to change locations, there might potentially be a low or reduced cost in making this change." So I said, "Hey, Grok, when you said to me about my laptop state that I was talking about, you said, that's Adam, that's a get out of jail free card." Well, I said, "So what you meant was get out of jail, meaning I can just change the laws by just get online and type into I'm in a new society. That's getting out of jail. And free was there's hardly any cost because I just have to use my laptop. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page, Grok, that's what you meant, right?" So I said, my question number one was, "I assume that in general you agree with my characterization of your original meaning. So just so we agree, that's what you meant, right?" Okay. So number two, if we apply this idea to the network state, which you didn't do before, Grok, you applied it to my idea. Now we're going to apply it to the network state. And in the same spirit of conversation, I assume that a person could still get out of jail with the network state, but that person would have to pay or forego the cost involved in changing their locations of domicile and or change their citizenship. In other words, with the network state, a person still could potentially get out of jail, quote unquote, in the sense in which you intended it in your original mentioning, but it would be less free because that person would have to change locations and citizenship in order to do so. So, in other words, I'm saying to Grok, well, the network state's a get out of free jail card. It's just it's not as free because I have to now move. So there's a moving expense and the citizenship paperwork. So yeah, but it's still get out of jail. I mean, if I'm overburdened here and over there, it's a paradise. The grass is green over there. I'm still getting it. So it's no different. But just one costs a lot more because I have to move and change citizenship. So I said, continuing with this line of thought, if we imagine that the network state is comprised of numerous non-contiguous territories, for example, if the network state administers a number of such small territories within the boundaries of most states that exist today, so the idea, let's say the network state did get some territories within all the existing states. There's 2 in France, 3 in Germany, there's 4 in the United States, there's 2 in England. Then this would significantly lower the cost of changing citizenship from one sovereign state to the network state. And the greater the number of non-contiguous territories administered by the network state, in other words, the more of these that the network state gets, the closer would the network state become to a get out of jail free card. So, hey, if you're saying my idea was get out of jail free, if the network state succeeds and they do get enclaves in the state that I live in now, that's getting pretty close to a get out of jail free card because I can just drive for a half an hour, and fill out some paperwork. And with AI, I'd probably get AI to fill out the paperwork. So if the network state succeeds and has lots of non-contiguous territories, that's a get out of jail free card. So I'm joking here, but we're all going to the same direction. In other words, I want to do a laptop state where I can change and stay in my room, and where the network state's going, if it succeeded and had enclaves in advanced Western countries, the only difference between that and what I was thinking is that I just have to now move an hour away, but I still get I'm still within a half hour of my favorite restaurant. I'm still in the same language. I'm still in the same state, the same amenities, and driving my same car. So the network state becomes a get out of jail free card in what Grok, humorously called the original concept of a non-territorial sovereign state. If there were numerous network state territories sprinkled around the globe, a citizen of an existing state could potentially become a citizen of a network state, yet remain within proximity to their present location, including their present language, culture, amenities, etc. So please comment on those three things, Grok. He said, yes, I agree with your characterization of what I meant by get out of jail free card phrase. I used it precisely to describe the mistaken idea that someone could simply adopt network state citizenship while remaining physically inside a legacy country. The free part referred to the absence of relocation or other exit costs. So we were, again, Grok's good. We're in agreement. So we're talking about the same thing here. In the actual network state model, the only way to live under the network state's own legal framework is to relocate to one of its recognized territories. So the escape from burdensome legacy laws is still possible. You still can get out of jail, but it is never free. The price is the ordinary friction of emigration, albeit to an ideologically aligned destination rather than a randomly chosen foreign country. So there's a cost, but there's a huge benefit. You're going to get to a country that's ideologically aligned with you, and that means the regulatory environment is going to be aligned with our values, assuming Balaji's values are somewhat close to ours. Your third observation follows directly from the model's own logic. Because the network state is explicitly designed as a global archipelago of many small, non-contiguous territories rather than a single contiguous landmass. Okay. Grok's saying, no, it isn't going to be one big state. It's supposed to be a whole bunch of small ones. Okay. The more such enclaves exist and the more widely they are distributed, the lower the relocation cost becomes for any given individual. Now we're back to asymptotic, because as these things spread, getting out of jail becomes less and less expensive. Someone living in, say, Berlin could move to a small network state charter city just a short train ride away instead of crossing oceans, Grok is saying. The same would hold in Sao Paulo, Singapore, or Lagos. As the number and geographic spread of those territories increase, the practical barrier to voting with your feet shrinks dramatically. Language and cultural continuity become easier to preserve. And the overall mechanism approaches the low friction ideal you described, still not literally free, but close enough that the exit option starts to feel far more accessible than traditional international migration. In that sense, Grok concludes, in that sense, a highly proliferated archipelago does move the network state closer to functioning as a practical get-out-of-jail mechanism for those who find their current jurisdiction intolerable. So, in conclusion, my note that I wrote was that what Balaji says, a cloud-first, land-last polity. My comment is that the polity only really applies to the geographical or territorial part. And when he says a country you can start from your laptop, really that is only upon territorial acquisition and diplomatic recognition. In other words, it's a little misleading to think that I'm starting a country from my laptop. The country begins when I succeed in having a territorial sovereign transfer land to me, and I'm able to achieve that while being transparent with the world that the reason I'm doing that is so that I can have a radically freer country than all the other countries, and posing a long-term threat to those countries. That's when the network state begins, is at that territorial transition. And that concludes the Grok discussion about the network state.
So that's where it begins, but I wonder if that's not where it ends, because I wonder if the territorial network state could become like the Adam Knott membership based state. So what I'm imagining is that, there are these network states that are territorial, and they emerged out of negotiation with the previous host countries. But what if that kind of negotiation then continued, um, with like treaties, where they negotiated certain freedoms that network state citizens would have in those other countries,
Mm-hmm.
and if those treaties involved those citizens living just as free in another country as they do in the network state country.
That's a good right. That's good, Dan. That's kind of how things could unfold. It's looking at a potential path forward. So one time I had an idea. I mean, it's not. I don't know how applicable it is, but I thought, why doesn't one of the U.S. states try to figure out a way to extend its protections on the basis that people would only have to reside there a certain amount of time, and try to work it out so that you could claim that they would back you up, that you were a citizen of that state, even if you spent more time out of the state. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that maybe that's not workable, but it would be, I thought it would be a great thing to approach, a forward-thinking governor and say, well, to get the protections of being your state, it's an interesting thing. How can you extend, like if I want to, how can Wyoming, for example, extend the reach of its protections that it offers to its citizens that reside there to and increase the number of people that could claim citizenship there, and then back them up legally when another state contests it. That to me, that'd be really an interesting. How much can they push that and say, no, Adam's a resident here because he did this and this and this, and this is in our law book, and he's a citizen of our state, and we're going to go to bat for him when that's contested. I'm sure it would be contested, but anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But the idea that states could start to advance you protections, legal protections, while you try to become a citizen of the globe, while having legal protections of your of a specific legal entity. Anyway, that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
But again, to conclude, I guess I thought that the significance of Balaji's network state is that it is, in my opinion, a libertarian attempt. It's libertarian in that it's implicitly starts from the premise that the existing legal framework is overly burdensome, and it's an attempt to, quote unquote, liberate a person or a group from the overly burdensome regulatory environment. Libertarianism, liberation, liberty, it's all stemming from the same, I don't know if it's a Greek word, but all stemming from the same. Dan knows, I don't know what
I think it's Latin.
Latin word. And so it's in the larger sense of libertarianism, as opposed to the more narrow sense, it's a libertarian attempt to solve the problem that we're all trying to solve, which is, if we're to the point where we don't feel that we voluntarily consented to the laws that we're subject to, but we feel powerless to stop them or change them, what other mechanisms or pathways are there for people like us And Balaji is earnestly trying to propose a solution. He's doing more than that. He's actually concretely pursuing it by having meetings in schools that try to initiate it. So in that sense, I commend him and his colleagues for doing that. But I would say, in all fairness, welcome to the party, welcome to the club, welcome to the world of libertarianism, welcome to our world. And we're glad to have you as fellow liberty warriors. At least I am, speaking for myself, and look forward to meeting you one day. That's all I have today, Dan.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you for sharing.
So I think we're going to close. People out there, we're going to close it down. And maybe we'll come up for the song for closing it down one day, like, this is the end of permissionless liberty, and then start the music. Wouldn't that be cool? And then Jake can just shut us down by putting that on when we get punchy. Anyway.
Right, just like when they play music to get people who are accepting awards off the stage.
Right, when you're going over the time, instead of the hook, it's the music starts going up and up and up, and the person has to furiously try and get in their last few words. Yeah. So well, we can discuss that off camera, I guess.
All right, see you next time.
All right, till next time.